My son put my name on his corporate documents without my permission. I had absolutely no idea what he had done until my phone rang on a quiet Tuesday morning. The voice on the other end calmly informed me that I was personally liable for $2.5 million. That was the exact moment I realized my only child had stolen my identity to fund his luxury lifestyle. I stood in my garden holding the phone, realizing I was about to lose the home I had built over 70 years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most. I was standing in this backyard under the morning sun, carefully pruning the climbing roses that grew along the southern brick wall of my house. My late wife Barbara and I had planted those roses 30 years ago when we first bought the property. They required constant attention, careful cuts, and patience to bloom properly. I had spent my entire career as a structural engineer designing load-bearing pillars for commercial bridges and municipal buildings. I understood how things were built to last, and I applied that same philosophy to my family, my finances, and my home. I was 70 years old, enjoying the quiet routine of a retired widower who had paid off his mortgage and secured a modest but comfortable military pension. I wiped the sweat from my forehead with a canvas glove and reached into the pocket of my denim work jacket when I felt my mobile phone vibrating against my chest. The caller identification displayed the name of a major national commercial bank. I assumed it was a routine solicitation for a new credit card or an automated reminder regarding a minor policy change. I answered the call with a polite greeting, keeping my pruning shears in my left hand. A woman with a cold, highly trained corporate voice asked to speak directly with George Dalton. I confirmed my identity. She did not exchange pleasantries. She informed me that she was a senior recovery agent from the commercial lending division. She stated clearly and firmly that my corporate business loan was currently 90 days past due and the bank was initiating pre-foreclosure protocols on my collateral assets. I let out a soft chuckle, assuming this was a sophisticated telephone scam or a ridiculous administrative error. I politely told the woman she had dialed the wrong number. I explained that I was a retired engineer, I had not owned a business in my entire life, and I certainly did not hold any commercial loans with her institution. The woman on the phone did not laugh. Her tone became sharper and far more severe. She informed me that I was recorded as the primary guarantor for a $2.5 million commercial credit line attached to an entity called Apex Solutions. The pruning shears slipped from my hand and fell into the dirt. Apex Solutions was the technology startup my son Matthew had founded 3 years ago. A sudden freezing sensation spread through my chest, completely drowning out the summer heat. I demanded to know how my name was attached to his company. The agent began to read back the information from her screen to verify my identity. She perfectly recited my full legal name and my exact date of birth. She read my 9-digit social security number without a single hesitation. She verified my home address, the exact square footage of my property, and the maiden name of my deceased wife. Then Mods delivered the final devastating blow. She recited the exact routing and account numbers of the private credit union where my fixed military pension was deposited every month. She informed me that if the $2.5 million balance was not addressed by the end of the business week, the bank would place a hard lien on my residential property and begin garnishment procedures against my retirement funds. My vision blurred. The solid foundation of my life was suddenly crumbling beneath my feet. I ended the call without saying another word. I did not bother to wash my hands or change out of my gardening clothes. I walked straight to my old pickup truck, started the engine, and drove toward the city. The highway stretched out before me, but my mind was trapped in the past. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. 3 years ago, Matthew had come to my house and sat at my kitchen table with tears in his eyes. He told me he had a revolutionary idea for a software company, but traditional venture capitalists were ignoring his pitches. He begged me for a small financial push to get his dream off the ground. I had spent 40 years waking up before dawn, working in freezing rain and blistering heat inspecting steel girders so my son could attend an expensive university. I wanted him to succeed more than I wanted anything else in the world. That night at the kitchen table, I wrote him a personal check for $50,000. It was nearly half of my liquid retirement savings. I gave it to him willingly, believing it was a father's ultimate gift to his only child. He had hugged me crying, promising he would make me proud. During the drive, the horrifying reality began to piece itself together. Matthew had not just taken my $50,000 to buy office computers or lease a workspace. He had used my personal financial information, the documents I had naively provided, to help him set up his initial banking, to completely bypass his own ruined credit score. He had built his entire corporate empire by secretly using my immaculate financial history as the structural support for his massive debt. I had spent years driving a 10-year-old truck and buying clothes on clearance so I could preserve my savings, while my son drove a brand-new luxury utility vehicle and dined at expensive restaurants entirely funded by a bomb strapped directly to my chest. I pulled into the pristine underground parking garage of the high-rise building where Apex Solutions occupied the top 3 floors. I walked into the massive glass and marble lobby. The environment was aggressively modern and completely sterile. Security guards in tailored suits stood near the polished steel elevator banks. I approached the reception desk and demanded to see Matthew Dalton immediately. The receptionist gave me a dismissive look, clearly judging my dirt-stained jeans and worn boots. She picked up a sleek telephone and whispered into the receiver. I stood there, my heart pounding against my ribs, waiting for my son to come down and explain the massive mistake. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. Matthew did not step out. Instead, my daughter-in-law Natalie walked across the marble floor. She was wearing a tailored designer suit that likely cost more than my first car, holding a leather handbag that matched her expensive shoes. She walked with an air of complete arrogance, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. She stopped a few feet away from me and crossed her arms. I asked her where Matthew was. Natalie looked at me with an expression of pure annoyance, as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into a fine dining restaurant. She informed me that Matthew was in an important creative meeting and could not be disturbed by unexpected family drama. I raised my voice, demanding to know why a commercial bank was threatening to seize my house over a $2.5 million loan. I expected her to look shocked or feign ignorance. Instead, Natalie let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so the security guards could not hear, but her tone was entirely devoid of guilt. She casually admitted that they had used my credentials to secure the initial funding rounds. She spoke about the fraud as if it were a minor administrative necessity. She coldly explained that Matthew had terrible credit from his previous failed business ventures, and the venture capital firms required a pristine guarantor to approve the massive cash injection. She looked me directly in the eyes and said my credit score was just sitting there, doing nothing, while Matthew was trying to build a legacy. She blamed me for being naive and out of touch with how modern business operated. She had the absolute audacity to stand in the lobby of a company built on my stolen identity and treat me like a nuisance. The disrespect was so profound, so entirely calculated, that the anger in my chest began to crystallize into something entirely different. Natalie reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a slim checkbook. She clicked a silver pen and hastily scribbled a number. She tore the check from the pad and shoved it against my chest. I reflexively caught the piece of paper before it fell. I looked down at the physical check. It was made out to me for $5,000. Natalie crossed her arms again and instructed me to take the money, pay the late fees the bank was asking for, and stop panicking over standard corporate debt structuring. She told me to go home, tend to my garden, and let the real professionals handle the business. Before I could formulate a response to her unbelievable arrogance, she snapped her fingers. 2 large security guards immediately stepped forward, positioning themselves between me and the elevator bank. Natalie turned her back to me and walked away, disappearing behind the steel doors without a second glance. The security guards placed their heavy hands on my shoulders, applying physical pressure to guide me toward the revolving glass doors. They escorted me out of the building and pushed me onto the cold, concrete sidewalk. The automatic doors locked behind me. I stood on the busy street corner clutching the insulting $5,000 check in my calloused hand. The wind cut through my thin jacket, but I did not shiver. The shock had completely evaporated. The sorrow of a father betrayed by his son vanished into the freezing air. I realized emotional pleas and fatherly disappointment meant absolutely nothing to them. They viewed me as a disposable resource, a silent foundation they could crack and destroy to build their glass towers. I slowly folded the check and placed it into my pocket. I did not scream at the building. I did not cause a scene. I turned and walked toward the regional headquarters of the commercial bank. They thought they had outsmarted a naive old man. They failed to realize that an engineer knows exactly which pillars to remove to bring a corrupted structure crashing down to the ground. The drive from my son's corporate office to the regional banking headquarters took exactly 40 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in complete silence, watching the familiar landscape of my city blur past the windows of my old truck. When I arrived at the massive steel and glass structure of the financial center, I parked in the visitor lot and turned off the engine. I took a deep breath, smoothing the collar of my denim jacket. I stepped out into the afternoon air, feeling a strange sense of calm settling over me. The initial shock had entirely burned away. What remained was a cold, calculated clarity. I walked through the heavy revolving doors of the bank, leaving the noise of the street behind. The main lobby was a cavernous space filled with polished marble floors and towering artificial plants. The air conditioning was freezing, carrying a sterile scent of floor wax and ozone. Several automated teller machines lined the far wall, but I ignored them. I walked directly past the velvet ropes of the standard customer service line and approached the raised mahogany desk of the branch manager. A young man in a sharp gray suit looked up from his computer monitor, offering a practiced, hollow smile. He politely asked if I needed assistance with a personal checking account. I told him I needed to speak with the director of commercial lending immediately. The young man chuckled softly, informing me that the commercial directors required appointments weeks in advance. He suggested I call the customer service number on the back of my debit card. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my back pocket, pulled out my leather wallet, and extracted my state-issued driver license. I placed the plastic card face down on the polished wood of his desk. I told him my name was George Dalton. I instructed him to type my name and my social security number into his terminal before he told me to make an appointment. The young man let out a small sigh of annoyance, his fingers flying across his keyboard. He asked for my social security number, and I recited it loud enough for him to hear, but quiet enough to keep the matter private. I watched his eyes track across the glowing screen. I saw the exact second his practiced smile completely vanished. The color drained from his face as the massive red warning flags of a $2.5 million pre-foreclosure alert likely illuminated his terminal. He swallowed hard quickly, picked up my license to verify the photograph, and handed it back to me with trembling fingers. He picked up his desk telephone, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper as he called the upper floors. Less than 2 minutes later, a woman in a severe black dress hurried out of a secure elevator. She introduced herself as the Senior Vice President of Regional Commercial Accounts. She did not offer to shake my hand. She looked at me with a mixture of profound caution and corporate fear. She gestured toward a frosted glass door at the back of the lobby. I followed her into a windowless, overly air-conditioned conference room. The room contained nothing but a sleek metal table and 4 uncomfortable chairs. She offered me a glass of water, which I declined. I sat down and placed my hands flat on the cold metal surface. I told her I wanted the physical loan origination file for Apex Solutions brought to this table immediately. I wanted every single piece of paper bearing my name. She nodded quickly, stating she would have to pull the documents from the secure digital archive and print them. She stepped out of the room, closing the heavy glass door behind her with a soft click. I sat alone in the sterile room for 30 minutes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system, pushing cold air through the ceiling vents. I looked at my hands resting on the table. They were the hands of a man who had built solid, enduring things. I had spent decades measuring stress loads and calculating structural integrity for massive steel bridges. My late wife Barbara and I had lived modestly, saving every extra dollar in a simple joint account. We never bought anything we could not pay for in cash. We never took family vacations to expensive resorts, choosing instead to camp at national parks, so we could put more money into a college fund for our only child. We built our lives on a foundation of absolute financial honesty. Now, sitting in this freezing corporate vault, I realized my entire legacy was being held hostage by invisible numbers on a digital ledger. The tension in the room grew suffocating. Every tick of the wall clock felt like a hammer striking an anvil. I was trapped in a financial prison my own flesh and blood had built for me. But as I sat there waiting for the documents that would detail my financial execution, my mind shifted from defense to offense. I began inspecting the invisible structure of this trap, looking for the fatal flaw I knew my arrogant son must have made. I was ready to see the paperwork. I was ready to add the blueprint of his betrayal. The heavy glass door swung open. The senior vice president returned carrying a thick stack of paper bound by a black metal clip. She placed the file on the metal table and pushed it toward me. The paper felt warm from the printer. I looked at the top sheet. It was a master commercial credit agreement. I slowly turned the pages, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. I reached the signature page. My breath caught in my throat. There at the bottom of the document was my name. George Dalton, written in blue ink. It was a masterful forgery. The slant of the letters, the sharp loop of the capital letter, the heavy pressure on the final stroke of my last name. It looked exactly like the signature I had used to sign the deed to my house 30 years ago. It looked like the signature I had placed on my late wife's hospital release forms when she was sick. My signature was my bond. It was the mark of my honor. But as I stared closer, I saw the subtle hesitations. The strokes were too slow, too careful. This was not a quick scribble done in a moment of panic. This was a practiced, deliberate replication. Matthew had spent hours studying my handwriting. He had likely hired a corrupt notary public to stamp the documents, verifying my physical presence when I was miles away tending to my garden. The betrayal was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a premeditated assassination of my financial life. I continued to turn the pages, digging deeper into the corporate charter of Apex Solutions. I expected to find my name listed as a secondary guarantor or a silent financial backer. What I found was infinitely worse. According to the state registration forms, the operating agreements, and the tax identification documents, I was not a co-signer. I was the sole proprietor. I was listed as the absolute owner and the chief executive officer of the entire corporation. Matthew had built an elaborate legal shield, and he had placed me entirely on the outside of it to take the full impact of any incoming fire. If the company failed, the government and the creditors would not look for him. They would come directly to my doorstep. I held the paper up to the harsh fluorescent light, feeling a sickening knot twist in my stomach. He had wrapped a massive financial anchor around my neck and thrown me into the ocean. By listing me as the sole owner, every single penny of that $2.5 million loan was tied directly to my Social Security number. My house, my military pension, my modest savings accounts. Everything I had worked for over 50 years was legally pledged as collateral. I frantically searched the remaining pages for Matthew's name. I found it buried in an employment addendum near the back of the file. Matthew Dalton was not an owner. He was not an executive officer. He was legally classified as an independent external consultant. His contract guaranteed him a massive monthly retainer fee, complete access to the corporate funds, and absolutely zero personal liability for the company debts. It was a brilliant, evil architecture, He had designed a system where he could extract all the wealth from the business while remaining a ghost to the banks. If the enterprise collapsed, his consultant contract would simply dissolve, leaving him entirely free to walk away without a single mark on his record. He would keep the money, and I would face total bankruptcy and potential criminal fraud charges for a company I did not even know existed. He had built his luxury life entirely on my grave. I lowered the document. The bank vice president was watching me carefully, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She expected me to break down crying. She expected me to plead ignorance and beg for mercy from the lending board. But a profound silence had fallen over my mind. The shock and the grief were entirely gone. I was a structural engineer. I had spent my life studying how weight is distributed, how pressure points operate, and how a poorly designed building can be brought down by removing a single crucial support beam. Matthew thought he had built an impenetrable fortress to protect himself. But in his arrogance, in his cowardly effort to push all the legal responsibility onto my shoulders, he had made a fatal miscalculation. By framing me as the absolute owner and the sole executive officer to avoid the risk, he had legally surrendered all control of the entity. He had handed me the absolute authority to dismantle his entire empire. He had given me the keys to his castle. I placed the corporate charter back onto the metal table and looked directly at the senior vice president. I told her that since I was legally recognized as the absolute owner and the chief executive officer of Apex Solutions, I required complete and immediate access to the current financial statements. I wanted to see the exact balance of the corporate operating accounts. I needed to know exactly how much capital was left from the $2.5 million commercial loan. The woman hesitated for a fraction of a second, her professional demeanor cracking under the immense tension in the room. She slowly opened a secondary folder she had brought in with the primary documents. She withdrew a thin stack of bank statements printed on light blue security paper. She did not slide them across the table. She simply placed them in front of herself and folded her hands tightly together. She looked at me with an expression that conveyed genuine human pity. She took a deep breath and informed me that the company accounts were entirely depleted. I reached across the table and pulled the blue papers toward me. I looked at the summary page for the primary operating account. The total available balance was listed as $412. My eyes traced the columns of numbers, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the devastation. $2.5 million had simply vanished into thin air. I asked her how a technology startup could possibly burn through that amount of capital in less than 36 months without producing a single physical product. I demanded the detailed transaction logs. I wanted to see the vendors. I wanted to see the payroll records. I wanted to see exactly where my stolen credit had been spent. The vice president turned to the next page of the ledger. She pointed a trembling finger at a long list of outbound international wire transfers. She explained that the capital had not been lost in failed business ventures or poor market investments. It had been systematically siphoned out of the domestic accounts. I read the ledger line by line. Every single week for the past 2 years, massive sums of money had been wired out of Apex Solutions. $50,000 on a Tuesday, $100,000 on a Thursday. The destination for every single transfer was the same. It was a private offshore trust account located in a jurisdiction known for extreme banking secrecy and corporate tax evasion. The money had been carefully and quietly drained from the company, leaving nothing but an empty shell designed to collapse on top of me. I demanded to know the name of the beneficiary listed on the offshore trust. The vice president typed a sequence of commands into a small digital tablet she had brought into the room. The banking system was interconnected, allowing her to trace the primary destination of the massive outgoing wires. She looked at the screen, her brow furrowing in confusion. She read the name aloud. The primary beneficiary of the offshore trust was not Matthew Dalton. The sole beneficiary was Natalie Dalton. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening precision. My daughter-in-law had not just been an arrogant bystander in the lobby. She was the architect of the extraction. I remembered her tailored designer suit, her expensive leather handbag, and the absolute confidence she displayed when she handed me that insulting $5,000 check. She was completely confident because she was holding all the stolen wealth. They had used the offshore trust to completely bypass domestic financial regulations. The vice president continued to read from her tablet, delivering the final lethal blow. She informed me that the offshore funds had been immediately leveraged to purchase luxury real estate properties under a corporate veil. They had bought a massive estate in a highly exclusive neighborhood, fully paid in cash, entirely insulated from the impending bankruptcy of Apex Solutions. Matthew and Natalie had engineered the perfect crime. They had used my pristine financial history to secure the loan. They had made me the sole legal owner to absorb the absolute liability. Then Matthew used his protected consultant status to authorize the wire transfers, funneling the cash directly into an untouchable account controlled by his wife. When the bank finally realized the loan was in default, Matthew and Natalie would be sitting in a paid-off mansion, sipping champagne while the debt collectors came to seize my modest home and garnish my military pension. They had deliberately hollowed out my life to build their palace. The vice president closed her folder. She told me that the bank would be forced to initiate aggressive asset seizure protocols by the end of the week because the corporate accounts were completely drained. She expected me to panic. She expected me to beg for a payment plan I could never afford. Instead, I carefully stacked the documents into a neat pile. I felt a profound, dangerous calm settle deep into my bones. They had taken all the money, but they had left behind the legal authority. They had drained the accounts, but they forgot to revoke my power. I thanked the vice president for her time, picked up the forged documents, and walked out of the bank. I knew exactly what I had to do next. The senior vice president leaned across the metal table, her voice dropping to a somber, urgent register. She explained the unforgiving mechanical reality of commercial lending. The bank operated on rigid automated schedules that did not care about family betrayal or forged signatures. The final grace period for the $2.5 million loan expired exactly at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the following Friday. It was a hard, non-negotiable deadline encoded directly into the mainframe of the financial institution. She outlined the sequence of events with chilling precision. If the corporate operating accounts remained empty at that exact minute, the system would automatically trigger a catastrophic cascade of legal actions. First, the bank would file a public notice of default, with the county clerk instantly destroying my personal credit rating. Second, they would immediately place a primary lien on my residential property. That was the home I had purchased with my late wife over 30 years ago. It was the house where I had built the wooden porch with my own hands, the place where I had carefully planted the rose garden to bring her joy during her final years. It was the only tangible legacy I had left in the world. The bank would seize it, lock the doors, and sell it at a public auction to recoup a fraction of their losses. But the destruction would not stop at the property line. Because my social security number was the primary anchor for the fraudulent corporate charter, the bank possessed the absolute legal right to garnish my fixed military pension. I had earned that pension through 20 years of demanding service. I had deployed to remote hostile environments, designing and building secure airfields under intense pressure. I had sacrificed my youth and my physical comfort for that guaranteed security. It was the money that kept the lights on and put food on my table. The vice president warned me that the corporate legal fees and the aggressive collection tactics would completely consume those monthly checks before they even reached my local credit union. I would be left completely destitute. I would be forced out of my own home, thrown onto the street, entirely dependent on the fragile charity of the state shelter system. Matthew and Natalie knew exactly what this timeline meant. They had calculated the days with surgical cruelty. They were simply waiting in their new luxury mansion for the Friday deadline to pass, knowing the bank would act as their personal executioner. The vice president folded her hands and gently suggested that I contact a bankruptcy attorney before the sun went down. She told me I needed to prepare for total financial liquidation. I did not take her advice. I looked at the sweeping second hand of the wall clock above her head. I had exactly 10 days to dismantle a $2.5 million corporate trap. I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, absolute focus. I placed my hands flat on the table and looked her directly in the eyes. I demanded certified, officially stamped copies of every single document in the primary file. I wanted the forged signature pages proving the initial fraud. I wanted the corporate charter explicitly naming me as the absolute owner and sole executive officer. I demanded the employment addendum that classified my son as nothing more than a disposable independent consultant. Most importantly, I required the complete, unredacted transaction logs detailing the exact dates and amounts of the offshore wire transfers sent to my daughter-in-law. The vice president seemed taken aback by the sudden commanding authority in my voice. She gathered the papers without another word of pity. She stepped out of the room and returned 15 minutes later, carrying a thick, heavy manila envelope sealed with the official corporate emblem of the bank. She handed it to me slowly, her eyes reflecting a quiet tragedy. She believed she was handing over my financial death warrant. I took the envelope, feeling the solid weight of the paper against my chest. She was wrong. This was not an execution order. This was my arsenal. I thanked her for her transparency and walked out of the freezing conference room. I crossed the massive marble lobby with steady, deliberate steps, completely ignoring the noise of the financial center. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. The air was warm, but I felt nothing but ice in my veins. The city looked completely different to me now. I walked to my old pickup truck in the visitor lot and placed the heavy envelope onto the passenger seat with extreme care. I sat behind the steering wheel and looked at the glowing digital clock on the dashboard. The countdown had officially started. My son believed he had trapped a helpless, naive old man in a collapsing building. He did not realize he had locked a master engineer inside the structural control room. I turned the ignition key, feeling the engine rumble to life. I did not need to run from the collapse. I simply needed to reroute the stress loads and watch his stolen empire shatter into a million pieces. I drove away from the towering glass structures of the financial district and navigated toward the older industrial side of the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the brick facades of the warehouses. I parked my truck in a narrow alley behind a weathered brick building. The brass plaque next to the heavy wooden door simply read, "Vincent Russo, Attorney at Law." I had known Vincent for nearly 30 years. We had met during a massive municipal bridge project in the late 1990s. I was the lead structural engineer, and he was the city forensic contract lawyer, auditing the supply chains for corruption. We shared a mutual respect built on a foundation of absolute pragmatism. He did not care about optics or corporate buzzwords. He cared about the raw, undeniable facts buried inside the paperwork. His office reflected his personality. There were no marble floors or artificial plants here. The space smelled of dark roasted coffee, old leather, and thousands of printed pages. Manila folders were stacked high on heavy oak filing cabinets. Vincent was sitting behind his massive desk, his reading glasses pushed down to the bridge of his nose, examining a legal brief under the warm glow of a brass desk lamp. He looked up as I walked in. He saw the expression on my face and immediately closed the file he was reading. He did not offer a cheerful greeting. He pointed to the leather chair opposite his desk and waited for me to speak. I sat down and placed the heavy bank-sealed envelope onto the center of his desk. I told him I needed his eyes on a catastrophic structural failure. I explained that my only son had built a $2.5 million corporate entity, and he had used my identity as the sacrificial foundation. Vincent did not interrupt me. He listened with absolute silence as I outlined the horrifying phone call from the commercial lender, the brutal confrontation in the lobby with my daughter-in-law, and the chilling discoveries I had just made inside the bank vault. I pushed the envelope across the desk. Vincent opened it carefully. He pulled out the thick stack of documents and laid them out under the light of his lamp. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner and the crisp rustle of paper as Vincent scrutinized the pages. I watched his eyes narrow as he examined the forged signature on the master credit agreement. I saw his jaw tighten as he read the corporate charter that listed me as the sole owner and chief executive officer. When he finally reached the transaction logs detailing the massive offshore wire transfers to Natalie, he let out a long, heavy breath. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked at me with a profound, quiet anger that mirrored my own. He told me it was one of the most ruthless and perfectly executed financial traps he had ever seen in his entire career. I leaned forward and told Vincent I wanted to file criminal fraud charges immediately. I wanted him to draft an emergency injunction to stop the bank from seizing my home based on the forged signature. I expected him to grab a pen and start drafting the legal offensive. Instead, Vincent leaned back in his leather chair and delivered a brutal dose of reality. He explained the agonizing machinery of the justice system. He told me that knowing the signature was a forgery and proving it in a court of law were two entirely different universes. If we filed a lawsuit claiming fraud, the commercial bank would immediately dispatch a team of high-priced corporate litigators to bury us in procedural delays. We would have to hire independent handwriting experts to analyze the ink and the stroke patterns. We would have to depose the corrupt notary public who would likely lie under oath or conveniently disappear across state lines. Furthermore, Matthew and Natalie would hire aggressive defense attorneys. Those lawyers would use the $50,000 check I had originally given Matthew as evidence. They would twist that fatherly gift and argue that I was an active investor who had willingly signed the documents and was now simply trying to back out of a failed business venture to save my own skin. Vincent looked me dead in the eye and laid out the devastating timeline. He said a complex commercial fraud case of this magnitude involving offshore trusts and corporate shell companies would take a minimum of 3 to 5 years to wind its way through the civil and criminal courts. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. 3 to 5 years. I reminded Vincent about the strict deadline the bank vice president had given me. The final grace period for the $2.5 million loan expired exactly at 5 o'clock next Friday. Vincent nodded slowly, his expression grim. He explained that the civil courts operate at a glacial pace, but commercial banks operate at the absolute speed of light. Even if we filed the lawsuit tomorrow morning, a judge would not grant a temporary restraining order against a massive commercial lender without overwhelming immediate and irrefutable proof of fraud, which we did not currently possess. Therefore, the bank would proceed with the default protocols next Friday without hesitation. They would place the primary lien on my house. They would lock the doors and prepare the property for public auction. They would begin garnishing my fixed military pension, immediately draining my accounts before the money even became available to me. Vincent stated clearly that by the time we ever got in front of a judge to present our handwriting experts and prove my innocence, I would be completely bankrupt. I would be evicted from the home I built with Barbara. I would be living in extreme poverty, unable to afford basic necessities, let alone pay Vincent his legal retainer to continue fighting the case. My son and my daughter-in-law had calculated this exact legal bottleneck. They knew the defensive route was a slow, agonizing death sentence. They had designed the trap so that the sheer crushing weight of the justice system and the aggressive corporate collection policies would destroy me before I could ever reach the courtroom. I sat in the quiet office staring at the scattered pages of the forged documents under the brass lamp. I was completely cornered. The law, the very system designed to protect the innocent, was entirely too slow to save my life. If I played by their rules and fought them in the traditional manner, I would lose everything I had ever built. I realized then that a defensive strategy was completely useless. Pleading my case to a judge would only give my son the time he needed to finalize his escape. I stepped out of Vincent the attorney's office into the cool evening air. The streetlights flickered to life, casting a harsh yellow glow over the cracked pavement of the industrial district. I unlocked the heavy door of my old pickup truck and slid onto the worn vinyl seat. I did not immediately start the engine. I needed a moment to process the absolute failure of the traditional justice system. The law would not save me, so I had to rely entirely on the structural authority my son had blindly handed over to me in his forged documents. As I reached for the ignition key, my mobile phone illuminated the dark cabin. The caller identification displayed my son's name. Hours earlier, seeing his name would have filled my chest with deep fatherly concern. Now it felt like looking at a venomous snake preparing to strike. I let the phone ring 3 times, controlling my breathing and steadying my heart rate before pressing the accept button and bringing the device to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply waited in the darkness of the truck. Matthew spoke first. His voice trembled with a perfectly practiced artificial sorrow. He sounded completely different from the arrogant executive who had hidden behind his wife in the lobby earlier that afternoon. He called me Dad, his tone dripping with a manufactured desperation. He launched into a highly rehearsed monologue about how the technology sector had suddenly and unexpectedly collapsed. He blamed unforeseen supply chain issues and aggressive venture capital firms for pulling their funding at the last possible second. He painted a tragic picture of a brilliant young entrepreneur victimized by a cruel corporate machine. I listened to his lies in absolute silence. I pictured the bank statements sitting in the sealed envelope on the passenger seat next to me. I knew exactly where the money had gone. It had not been lost to a volatile market. It had been carefully and deliberately wired to his wife's offshore trust account. But I did not interrupt him. I let him spin his elaborate web of deceit, absorbing every single word to harden the armor around my heart. He spoke about how heavily this financial burden weighed on his soul completely, ignoring the fact that he had strapped a $2.5 million anchor around my neck. As he continued his performance, a painful memory surfaced in my mind. I remembered teaching Matthew how to ride a bicycle in the park behind our old house. When he fell and scraped his knee, I did not coddle him. I picked him up, dusted him off, and told him that a man must always take responsibility for his own balance. I had spent his entire childhood trying to instill a sense of absolute accountability in him. Listening to him now shifting the blame to invisible market forces while actively stealing my identity, I realized I had failed completely. He had not learned responsibility. He had only learned how to manipulate the people who loved him. After exhausting his performance of false grief, Matthew finally arrived at the true purpose of his phone call. His voice shifted, adopting a tone of serious business pragmatism. He told me that the commercial bank was going to be completely unreasonable. He warned me that they would aggressively pursue the remaining debt and that I was directly in their line of fire. Then he delivered the most breathtaking insult of my entire life. He asked me to voluntarily declare personal Chapter 7 bankruptcy by the end of the week. He framed it as a necessary tactical sacrifice to save the family legacy. He actually argued that because my professional career was over and I was already retired, my credit score no longer mattered. He claimed that a bankruptcy on his record would completely destroy his reputation in the technology industry and ruin his chances of securing future investments. He was asking me to legally fall on my sword so he could walk away from the disaster he had deliberately engineered. He wanted me to permanently destroy my financial dignity, surrender my pension, and lose the home his mother loved, all so he could maintain the illusion of being a successful corporate founder. Before I could even process his staggering audacity, Matthew offered his twisted version of charity. He told me I would inevitably lose my house to the bank auction, but he quickly assured me that I would not be homeless. He announced that he and Natalie had just closed on a beautiful new estate outside the city limits. He graciously offered to let me live in the unfinished basement of their new home. He framed it as a generous favor from a loving son. He told me I could help Natalie with the gardening and run daily errands for them to earn my keep and stay active. He was offering me a concrete floor in a house purchased entirely with my stolen money. My own son was inviting me to become an indentured servant in the palace he had built on the ruins of my life. The sheer arrogance of his proposition was the final catalyst I needed. The last lingering drop of paternal hesitation completely evaporated from my soul. The sorrow was replaced by a magnificent freezing clarity. I realized that arguing with him would only validate his delusion of control. I did not scream into the receiver. I did not curse his name. I did not threaten him with the corporate charter sitting beside me. I simply took the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call button. The line went dead. I placed the phone in my pocket and turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life. My son thought he had successfully buried me in the dark. He did not realize he had just handed me the shovel. I sat in the dark cabin of my truck staring at the blank screen of my phone. The silence that followed the end of the call was absolute. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of mourning. It was the clear, sharp silence that follows a massive structural collapse. The dust had finally settled, revealing the true shape of the ruin. For 70 years, I had believed that family was an unbreakable foundation. I had believed that blood was the strongest mortar a man could use to build a life. I had been a fool. The son I had raised, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and helped with his mathematics homework, was completely gone. In his place stood a parasite, a hollow corporate shell wearing my son's face, speaking with his voice but completely devoid of his soul. The lingering ache in my chest, the desperate hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, evaporated into the cool night air. The grief died right there in the driver's seat of my truck. It was replaced by something far more powerful. It was replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a master engineer. I had spent my entire adult life analyzing stress loads, identifying weak points in massive steel structures, and calculating the exact amount of force required to bring a compromised building safely to the ground. I had spent 40 years understanding how weight transfers, how fractures spread, and how gravity eventually claims everything that is built on a lie. Now I turned that identical analytical lens onto my own life. I looked at the twisted architecture of my son's betrayal. I stopped seeing a personal tragedy and started seeing a complex mathematical equation. He had built an elaborate, shining empire on stolen credit and forged signatures. He had used my pristine name as the central load-bearing pillar for his entire fraudulent existence. As I gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel, a bitter and uncomfortable truth washed over me. I had helped build this monster. My unconditional love had been the ultimate enabling force. When he failed out of his first university program, I quietly paid the tuition for a second, without demanding any real accountability. When he crashed his first car because he was driving recklessly, I dipped into my savings and bought him another so he would not have to experience the indignity of taking the public bus. I had spent decades acting as a human shock absorber for his terrible decisions, completely shielding him from the natural, painful consequences of his actions. I thought I was protecting him from a harsh world. I thought I was being a loving and supportive father, but I had actually been teaching him that the fundamental rules of society did not apply to him. I had taught him that no matter how deep of a financial or moral hole he dug for himself, his father would always jump in and sacrifice his own body to build a ladder to get him out. My endless, uncomplaining sacrifices had slowly mutated into his absolute toxic entitlement. He truly believed he deserved to live in a luxury mansion purchased with stolen money while I slept on a concrete basement floor. He believed this because I had spent his entire life demonstrating that my comfort, my security, and my dignity were always entirely secondary to his desires. I had trained him to view me not as a human being, but as an endless resource to be mined and discarded when the well ran dry. That era of unconditional sacrifice was officially over. The reservoir of my patience was completely empty. He had pushed me far past the breaking point, straight into a realm of pure, unadulterated consequence. I looked down at the heavy manila envelope resting on the passenger seat in the shadows. The forged documents inside were no longer a terrifying threat. They were the precise blueprints for my retaliation. Matthew had legally crowned me the absolute ruler of his stolen kingdom to shield himself from the fallout. He thought I was too old, too naive, and too emotionally shattered to ever pick up the weapon he had so foolishly placed in my hands. He was about to learn a terrifying lesson about structural integrity. I turned the ignition key. The old engine roared to life, cutting through the silence of the alleyway. I shifted the truck into gear and pulled out onto the neon-lit city streets. I was not going home to weep in my garden. I was going to systematically dismantle his life brick by brick, dollar by dollar, until there was absolutely nothing left. I navigated my truck back through the darkened streets of the industrial district and parked in the exact same alleyway I had left less than an hour ago. I walked up to the heavy wooden door of Vincent Russo's office and knocked hard. A moment later, the door swung open. Vincent was standing there with his coat on and his briefcase in his hand, looking completely exhausted. He frowned when he saw me standing under the flickering porch light. He told me to go home and get some sleep before we started preparing the bankruptcy filings in the morning. I stepped past him into the office and turned on the overhead lights. I told him I was not going to file for bankruptcy. I was not going to spend the next 5 years begging a judge to believe my signature was forged. I walked over to his desk, picked up the thick stack of forged corporate documents, and spread them out across the polished wood. I looked my old friend in the eye and told him we were looking at the problem from the completely wrong angle. We were looking at it like victims trying to prove a crime. I wanted him to look at the paperwork like an engineer examining a structural blueprint. Vincent slowly took off his coat and set his briefcase down on the floor. He walked back behind his desk and put his reading glasses back on his face. He asked me what exactly I was looking for. I pointed to the primary corporate charter sitting in the center of the desk. I told him Matthew had built a massive fortress to protect himself from the $2.5 million debt. He had placed himself entirely outside the castle walls as an independent consultant. He had locked me inside the throne room as the sole owner and chief executive officer, so I would take the absolute fall when the walls finally collapsed. I asked Vincent to read the specific bylaws regarding executive authority. I wanted to know exactly what power the chief executive officer held in a company structured in this specific manner. Vincent pulled the charter toward him and began to read the dense legal text. The room was perfectly quiet for several long minutes. As his eyes tracked across the page, I saw his posture completely change. He leaned closer to the paper, a look of profound disbelief washing over his face. He looked up at me and then back down at the document, his legal mind racing to process the massive oversight my son had made. Vincent took a deep breath and explained the fatal flaw in Matthew's brilliant and arrogant plan. In his desperate attempt to completely shield himself from any financial or legal liability, Matthew had deliberately omitted the creation of a board of directors. He had not established any voting shareholders or secondary executive officers. He had legally designated me as the absolute uncontested dictator of Apex Solutions. Vincent's voice grew louder, animated by the sheer audacity of the legal reality unfolding in front of us. He explained that if we went to court and argued the signature was forged, we would be fighting from a position of absolute weakness. We would be trying to dismantle the entire corporate structure piece by piece while the bank destroyed my life. But if we simply accepted the documents as absolute truth, the entire dynamic would instantly flip. If we stepped into the role my son had so carefully crafted for me, I did not need a judge to grant me a temporary restraining order. I did not need to hire expensive handwriting experts. According to the very documents Matthew had filed with the state and federal government, I possessed the supreme legal authority to do whatever I wanted with the corporation. I asked Vincent to be absolutely specific because I needed to know the exact limits of my new power. Vincent picked up a legal pad and began writing with furious speed. He told me that as the sole acting executive, I had the immediate unilateral authority to freeze every single corporate bank account without providing notice. I had the power to sever all vendor contracts and cancel all active projects. I could completely liquidate any remaining physical or intellectual assets the company possessed without asking for permission from anyone. And most importantly, Vincent paused and tapped his pen against the desk. He looked directly at me and stated that I had the absolute legal right to terminate any independent consultant currently under contract with the company. A cold smile spread across my face for the first time since my phone had rung that morning. Matthew had spent 3 years treating me like a naive fool. He thought the title of Chief Executive Officer was nothing more than a heavy anchor designed to drag me to the bottom of the ocean. He did not realize he had actually handed me the steering wheel to his entire ship. I asked Vincent what would happen if Matthew tried to stop me from exercising these powers. Vincent laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed in the quiet room. He explained that Matthew had zero legal standing. If Matthew tried to intervene, he would be forced to go into a courtroom and admit that he had forged the federal documents in the first place. He was completely trapped by his own intricate lies. He could not fight my authority without confessing to massive corporate fraud and facing a lengthy federal prison sentence. I pulled out a leather chair and sat down at the desk. I told Vincent we were not going to sleep tonight. We were going to stay in this office and draft every single piece of corporate legislation required to completely paralyze Apex Solutions. Vincent opened his laptop and began typing rapidly. We spent the next 6 hours turning the forged documents into a devastating legal arsenal. We drafted the official banking resolutions required to lock down the domestic accounts and block any further offshore transfers. We prepared the formal termination notices, specifically outlining the immediate cancellation of Matthew's lucrative consulting contract. Every single document we created was perfectly legal, utterly ruthless, and entirely supported by the fraudulent foundation my son had built. As the sun began to rise over the city, casting a pale gray light through the office windows, Vincent printed the final stack of resolutions. He placed them in a neat pile in front of me and handed me a heavy brass pen. For the first time in this entire nightmare, I was not looking at a forged replication of my signature. I took the pen and signed my name with absolute, deliberate precision. I signed as the sole owner. I signed as the Chief Executive Officer. I had fully accepted the heavy crown my son had forced onto my head, and I was going to use it to burn his stolen kingdom to the ground. I left Vincent the attorney's office just as the morning traffic began to choke the city streets. The sun was fully above the horizon, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the concrete buildings. I had not slept a single minute, but I did not feel tired. I felt a surge of cold energy pulsing through my veins. The heavy manila envelope resting on the passenger seat of my truck no longer contained a threat. It contained the legally binding corporate resolutions we had drafted over the past 6 hours. I drove past the crowded coffee shops and the rushing pedestrians moving with a singular quiet purpose. I arrived at the main downtown branch of the primary corporate bank at exactly 8:45 in the morning. I parked my truck and waited in the silent cabin for 15 minutes, watching the heavy glass doors until a security guard walked over and unlocked them for the start of the business day. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the lobby just as the grand wall clock struck 9. I did not go to the teller window. I walked directly to the elevated desk of the branch director. A middle-aged woman in a navy suit looked up from her computer and offered a polite morning greeting. I did not return her smile. I introduced myself as George Dalton, the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Solutions. I placed my state-issued driver license and the thick stack of freshly signed corporate resolutions directly onto her desk. I told her I was initiating an immediate emergency freeze on all domestic operating accounts, all corporate credit lines, and all vendor payment portals associated with my company. The director looked slightly confused by my worn denim jacket, but her eyes quickly darted to the official legal seals on the paperwork. She picked up the documents and began to read. I watched her professional demeanor shift into a state of heightened alarm. She excused herself and walked quickly into a back-off office to consult with the legal compliance department. I stood alone in the quiet lobby for 20 minutes, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioning. When she finally returned, her face was completely pale. She informed me that the legal department had verified my absolute authority according to the state and federal charters. She sat down at her terminal and began typing with rapid, nervous keystrokes. I stood over her desk and watched the glowing monitor. I demanded verbal confirmation for every single action she took. She confirmed that the primary operational checking account, which held the remaining $70,000 of working capital, was now completely frozen. No outgoing wire transfers could be initiated. No paper checks could be cashed. She confirmed that the 4 corporate credit cards issued to Matthew Dalton under his consultant status were instantly deactivated. She confirmed that the automated payroll systems and the vendor payment gateways were completely suspended. I instructed her to place a hard security lock on the accounts, stipulating that absolutely no changes could be made without my physical presence in the branch and my direct physical signature. She clicked the final button on her mouse and looked up at me. She whispered that the accounts were fully locked. In less than 10 minutes, without raising my voice or causing a scene, I had completely severed the financial oxygen supply to my son's stolen empire. I thanked the director for her efficiency, gathered my documents, and walked out of the bank. I stepped back into the morning sun and took a deep breath of the city air. The most critical element of this strike was absolute silence. I did not send Matthew a warning text message. I did not leave him an angry voicemail demanding an explanation. If I had yelled at him or threatened him, I would have given him a target to fight. I would have given him time to prepare his defenses or move the remaining capital to a secondary shadow account. By moving in total silence, I transformed his own arrogant assumption against him. He assumed I was currently sitting in my house weeping over the impending loss of my property, entirely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his betrayal. He assumed his fortress was perfectly secure. I walked to a small diner across the street from the bank and ordered a black coffee. I sat in a booth by the window watching the city move and visualized exactly what was happening on the top floors of the Apex Solutions glass tower. Matthew was likely sitting in his corner office wearing a bespoke suit, preparing to start his day. He would attempt to use his platinum corporate card to pay for a catered executive breakfast, and the terminal would coldly decline the transaction. He would laugh it off as a minor banking glitch and tell his assistant to try the secondary card. That card would also decline. Annoyance would slowly mutate into genuine concern. He would log into the corporate banking portal on his laptop to manually transfer funds, only to find a bold red security banner stating that his administrative access had been permanently revoked by the chief executive officer. The realization would hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He would frantically call the bank, demanding to speak to a manager, screaming about his authority as the founder. The bank would coldly inform him that according to the legal charter he had filed himself, he was merely an independent consultant, and they could not discuss the account with unauthorized personnel. He would stare at the screen, his heart pounding against his ribs as the horrible truth washed over him. The millions of dollars he had wired offshore were safe for now, but the domestic engine required to keep the illusion alive was entirely dead. Without the ability to pay his server hosting fees, his software engineers, or the massive lease on his office space, the company would implode in a matter of days. He had built a massive, terrifying machine to destroy my life, but I had just quietly removed the entire engine. He would realize that the old man he had discarded in the lobby had quietly stepped into the control room and locked the door from the inside. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste. The silent adjustment was working perfectly. I left the coffee shop and drove straight back to the industrial district. When I walked into Vincent, the attorney's office, the air was thick with the smell of dark roasted coffee and ozone from the laser printer. Vincent had not left his desk. His computer monitor was surrounded by a massive mountain of freshly printed documents, completely different from the bank files we had reviewed the night before. He looked up at me, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but sharp with a predatory focus. I told him the domestic accounts were completely locked down, and my son was officially cut off from the operating cash. I expected him to nod in satisfaction. Instead, He shook his head and pushed a thick stack of paper across the mahogany wood. He told me that freezing the remaining $70,000 was nothing more than a minor flesh wound. He said we had completely misunderstood the actual scale of my son's ambition. Matthew had not taken out a $2.5 million commercial loan just to pay for a fancy office and luxury dinners. He had actually built something highly valuable. Vincent explained that while I was at the bank, he had used my newly weaponized executive credentials to initiate a deep forensic audit of the corporate digital footprint. He had legally bypassed my son's administrative passwords and subpoenaed the state intellectual property registry. He had uncovered a massive hidden asset. Apex Solutions was not just an empty shell company designed to hold debt. Over the past 3 years, Matthew had used my stolen credit to hire a team of brilliant freelance software engineers. Together, they had developed a highly specialized proprietary digital algorithm. Vincent pointed to a dense technical schematic on the desk. He explained it was a predictive data routing program designed to optimize global shipping logistics and reduce supply chain waste. It was not a product meant for regular consumers. It was a highly sophisticated, perfectly engineered digital skeleton key, and it was currently the target of a massive corporate bidding war. Vincent pulled a printed email thread from the bottom of the pile. The emails were direct correspondence between Matthew and the acquisitions director of a massive multinational technology conglomerate based in Silicon Valley. The giant corporation did not want to buy Apex Solutions as a whole. They only wanted to purchase the absolute exclusive rights to the routing algorithm to integrate into their global servers. Vincent traced his pen down to the final message in the thread. It was a digital term sheet mutually agreed upon by both parties just 2 days ago. The purchase price for the intellectual property was a staggering $3 million in pure liquid cash. Then Vincent pointed to the date and time stamped at the top of the finalized acquisition contract. The official closing for the software sale was scheduled for this coming Friday, exactly at noon. The air in the office suddenly felt freezing cold as the final horrifying layer of my son's master plan revealed itself. It was a masterpiece of synchronized destruction. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a perfectly calculated execution schedule. Vincent laid out the mechanics of the trap. On Friday morning, Matthew would log into the virtual closing room acting as the authorized corporate consultant. He would sign the digital rights of the algorithm over to the multinational conglomerate. He would instruct the buyers to wire the $3 million purchase price directly into the offshore trust account, controlled by his wife, Natalie. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the transaction would be complete, and the money would be entirely outside the legal jurisdiction of the United States. Then, Matthew would formally invoke the termination clause in his own consulting contract, legally severing all his ties with Apex Solutions. He would simply walk away, his massive wealth secured in a tropical tax haven, leaving behind a completely hollowed-out corporate corpse. 4 hours later, at exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the commercial bank's automated grace period would expire. The lending officers would look at Apex Solutions and find $0 in the operating accounts and absolutely zero intellectual property left to liquidate or sell. The company would be functionally dead. The bank would immediately trigger the catastrophic default protocols. They would place the massive lien on my house and begin garnishing my military pension to recover their $2.5 million. Matthew had engineered a precise 5-hour window to slip out the back door, with a fortune leaving me locked inside the burning building to take the absolute fall. He had timed my financial death down to the exact minute. I sat in the leather chair staring at the printed emails. The sheer calculated cruelty of his timeline stripped away any remaining shred of humanity I saw in my son. He was not a desperate man making a foolish business mistake. He was an apex predator who had spent 3 years fattening me up for the slaughter. I felt the familiar cold precision of my engineering background completely take over my mind. A structural collapse is only devastating if you are standing blindly in the impact zone. But if you seize control of the demolition charges, You can direct the blast entirely onto your enemy. I looked at Vincent. I reminded him that Matthew was legally nothing more than a disposable external consultant. According to the forged state charters, I was the absolute uncontested owner of Apex Solutions. Therefore, the proprietary software algorithm did not belong to my son. It belonged entirely to me. I asked Vincent if my executive authority granted me the power to intercept the acquisition. Vincent leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his exhausted face. He confirmed that as the chief executive officer, I had the supreme legal right to step into the negotiation, hijack the final contract, and dictate exactly where the $3 million purchase price would be deposited. Matthew had lined up the perfect shot to secure his stolen wealth, but he had legally handed me the loaded weapon. We were not going to wait for Friday to arrive. We were going to steal the algorithm right out of his hands. We did not wait for the end of the day to execute the next phase of the demolition. Vincent immediately drafted a formal executive communication using his secure legal server. He sent a direct message to the lead acquisition director of the Silicon Valley conglomerate, officially introducing himself as the external corporate counsel for Apex Solutions. He did not mention my son. He simply stated that the absolute owner and chief executive officer of the company required an urgent in-person meeting to finalize the pending intellectual property transfer. The technology executives were currently operating out of a luxury hotel suite in the center of our city, preparing for the scheduled Friday closing. Because Vincent used the correct legal terminology and attached a certified copy of the state charter proving my absolute authority, they agreed to meet with us at 1 o'clock that very afternoon. I did not go home to change into a tailored suit. I brushed the dust from my denim work jacket, adjusted the collar of my flannel shirt, and drove my old pickup truck directly to the most expensive hotel in the financial district. I walked through the gilded revolving doors of the hotel lobby, my heavy work boots sinking into the thick imported carpets. Vincent walked beside me carrying his worn leather briefcase. We took the private elevator to the penthouse level, where the conglomerate had rented a massive conference suite. A private security guard opened the double oak doors, revealing a room surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city skyline. 3 executives were waiting for us at a massive glass table. They wore sharply tailored minimalist clothing and possessed the aggressive, impatient energy of people who bought and sold companies before eating breakfast. The lead acquisition director, a man in his early 40s with perfectly styled hair, stood up when we entered. His confident smile instantly vanished when he saw me. He looked past my shoulder, expecting Matthew to walk through the door behind me. When he realized it was just Vincent and an old man in a worn jacket, profound confusion washed over his face. The director did not offer to shake my hand. He looked at Vincent and demanded to know where Matthew Dalton was. He stated very clearly that his team had spent the last 6 months negotiating the acquisition of the routing algorithm exclusively with Matthew. He warned us that they did not have time for internal family drama or unauthorized shareholder disputes. I did not raise my voice, and I did not act intimidated by his wealth or his aggressive posture. I pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs and sat down at the head of the glass table. I placed my calloused hands flat on the cool surface. I looked directly into the eyes of the lead director and introduced myself as George Dalton. I told him I was the sole legal owner and the only recognized executive officer of Apex Solutions. I informed him that Matthew Dalton was nothing more than an independent contractor whose temporary consulting agreement was currently under severe legal review. The director let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He told me I was completely mistaken. He claimed Matthew had presented himself as the founder and the visionary behind the entire software architecture. He crossed his arms and told me he was going to call Matthew immediately to clear up this ridiculous misunderstanding. I did not try to stop him. Instead, Vincent opened his briefcase and pulled out the certified copies of the state and federal corporate charters. He slid the thick stack of paper across the glass table directly into the hands of the conglomerate's lead corporate attorney, a woman sitting to the right of the director. She put on her reading glasses and began scanning the documents. The room grew incredibly quiet. I watched her eyes move rapidly across the forged signature pages and the absolute ownership declarations. I saw the exact moment she realized the horrifying legal reality of the situation. She reached out and gently pushed the director's telephone down before he could make the call. She whispered into his ear, confirming that every single word I had just spoken was the absolute legal truth. According to the United States government, Matthew Dalton owned absolutely nothing, and I owned everything. The arrogant posture of the tech executives completely evaporated. They were not loyal to my son. They were loyal to the algorithm, and they suddenly realized they had been negotiating with a ghost. The director sat down slowly, his eyes locked onto mine with a newly discovered respect. I took control of the entire room. I told them I understood the structural mechanics of their industry. I knew they needed this proprietary routing algorithm to optimize their global servers, and I knew they were prepared to pay $3 million for the exclusive rights. I told them I was fully prepared to honor the exact purchase price they had negotiated with my consultant. However, I informed them that the structural integrity of the previous deal was completely compromised. The closing would not happen on Friday afternoon. The transaction was going to happen right now, today, in this very room under my absolute authority. Furthermore, I informed them that the previous banking instructions provided by Matthew Dalton were officially terminated. I knew Matthew had directed them to wire the $3 million into an offshore trust account controlled by his wife. I told the executives that if they sent a single penny to that offshore destination, I would personally tie their conglomerate up in federal litigation for the next 10 years, effectively destroying the algorithm before they could ever use it. Vincent produced a new legally binding financial routing document. He slid it across the table. I instructed the executives to wire the entire $3 million purchase price directly into a highly secure domestic legal escrow account entirely controlled by Vincent's law firm. The tech executives looked at each other, realizing they had absolutely no leverage to argue. They did not care about Matthew's offshore dreams. They simply wanted the intellectual property. The lead attorney reviewed my new banking instructions, nodded her head, and pulled a silver pen from her pocket. She handed the pen to the director. I watched him sign the new acquisition agreement, completely erasing my son from the transaction. The algorithm was sold, the money was safely secured in an untouchable account, and my son's grand escape plan was quietly and permanently destroyed. The heavy glass doors of the penthouse suite closed behind us, sealing the agreement. I stood in the hotel corridor with Vincent, the signed acquisition contract safely secured inside his leather briefcase. We did not celebrate. There was no joy in this victory. It was a precise, calculated surgical strike to remove a malignant tumor that had infected my family. We took the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The city felt entirely different now. It was no longer a towering fortress of my son's deceit. It was a landscape where I had just seized absolute control. Vincent's mobile phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, and nodded slowly. He confirmed that the technology conglomerate had moved with breathtaking speed. They did not want to risk losing the algorithm to a competitor. The entire $3 million purchase price had just been wired domestically. It was not traveling to a secret offshore trust in a tropical tax haven. It had bypassed my daughter-in-law entirely. The money was now sitting securely in an untouchable legal escrow account, completely controlled by Vincent's law firm. The financial oxygen supply was not just severed, the entire tank had been emptied. I looked at my watch. It was exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. We had less than 24 hours before Matthew's scheduled Friday morning closing the event he thought would secure his fortune. He was currently sitting in his corner office, completely unaware that his grand masterpiece had just been sold to the highest bidder by the old man he had discarded. The silent adjustment was nearly complete, but the final execution required a public, undeniable confrontation. I did not want him to simply find the accounts empty. I needed him to understand exactly who had dismantled his empire. Vincent and I returned to his office in the industrial district. We spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing the final documentation for the emergency board meeting. According to the corporate bylaws Matthew had forged, the chief executive officer possessed the unilateral right to convene a shareholder meeting at any time requiring the mandatory attendance of all contracted consultants. We drafted the official summons and sent it directly to Matthew's corporate email address. The summons was completely devoid of emotion. It did not mention the frozen accounts or the sold algorithm. It simply stated that an emergency executive review would take place the following morning at 9 o'clock in the primary conference room of a neutral luxury hotel to discuss the immediate financial restructuring of Apex Solutions. I went home that evening to the quiet house I had built with Barbara. I walked through the empty rooms, the silence heavier than usual. I stood in the kitchen, where 3 years ago I had handed Matthew a $50,000 check, believing I was investing in my son's brilliant future. I realized now I had been funding my own execution. I went out to the backyard and stood by the rose bushes as the sun set. I did not feel the crushing sorrow I had experienced the day before. The grief had been burned away, leaving a core of hardened steel. I had protected this house. I had protected my pension. I had protected my dignity. But the cost was the total, irreversible destruction of my only child. I woke up before dawn the next morning. I did not put on a suit. I wore my clean denim work jacket, a pressed flannel shirt, and my sturdy boots. I wanted Matthew to look across the table and see the exact same working-class father he had tried to bury. I drove to the city and met Vincent in the lobby of the designated hotel. We walked into the grand conference room at exactly 8:45. The room was expansive, featuring a massive mahogany table and tall windows overlooking the financial district. We placed our leather folders on the table and waited in absolute silence. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy double doors swung open. Matthew walked into the room. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit that fit him perfectly, projecting an image of absolute corporate power. Natalie walked closely behind him, dressed in an expensive designer outfit, carrying the same luxury handbag she had when she handed me that insulting $5,000 check. They were accompanied by 2 men in sharp gray suits carrying thick briefcases. These were clearly expensive corporate defense attorneys. Matthew and Natalie looked supremely confident. They believed this meeting was my desperate surrender. They believed I had finally buckled under the pressure of the commercial bank's deadline and was ready to sign the personal bankruptcy papers to save his reputation. Matthew sat down directly across from me, a smug, artificial smile playing on his lips. Natalie sat beside him, crossing her arms, her posture radiating absolute contempt. The 2 defense lawyers flanked them, opening their briefcases and pulling out thick stacks of legal documents. Matthew leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany. He spoke with the condescending tone of a parent addressing a foolish child. He thanked me for finally seeing reason. He pushed a pen across the table, urging me to sign the bankruptcy filings quickly so they could return to their busy schedules. He reminded me of his generous offer to let me live in the unfinished basement of their new mansion. I did not touch the pen. I did not raise my voice. I looked directly into my son's eyes. The artificial smile on his face slowly began to falter under the weight of my absolute freezing silence. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He glanced at his lawyers, suddenly unsure of his footing. The trap was set. The audience was seated. It was time to show him the structural reality of the empire he had built on my name. The heavy mahogany doors of the luxury hotel conference room swung closed behind Vincent and me, sealing us inside with the people who had tried to destroy my life. The room was expansive, designed to project wealth and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the city's financial district, the very towers my son had desperately tried to conquer. The air conditioning was set low, making the room feel like a sterile vault. A massive oval table made of polished dark wood dominated the center of the space. Matthew and Natalie were already seated at the far end of the table. They looked like royalty presiding over a court. Matthew was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that fit his shoulders perfectly, his hair styled with expensive precision. Natalie sat beside him wearing a sharp designer dress, her posture radiating an absolute chilling arrogance. She had her expensive leather handbag resting on the table next to her, the very same bag she had reached into to hand me that insulting $5,000 check just a few days ago. They were flanked by two men in immaculate gray suits, their corporate defense attorneys, who were already pulling thick stacks of legal documents from their briefcases. They looked supremely confident. They looked like people who had already won the war. As Vincent and I walked toward the table, Matthew did not stand up to greet me. He simply leaned back in his plush leather chair, resting his elbows on the armrests, and offered a practiced, hollow smile. He looked at my worn denim work jacket and my scuffed boots with a mixture of pity and superiority. He truly believed he was watching a defeated old man walking to the gallows. He believed the emergency board meeting I had called was nothing more than my formal surrender. Matthew spoke first, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. He used a tone of exaggerated patience, the kind a parent might use with a difficult child who had finally realized their mistake. He said he was glad I had finally decided to be reasonable. He told me he knew the last 48 hours had been stressful, but that signing the bankruptcy papers today was the only logical way to protect his professional reputation and save the family legacy. He actually used those words. He talked about saving the family legacy while sitting across from the father he had systematically betrayed. Natalie chimed in, her voice sharp and condescending. She did not even bother to look at me directly. She spoke to the space just above my head, telling me that the defense attorneys had prepared all the necessary Chapter 7 bankruptcy documents. She reminded me of their generous offer to let me live in the unfinished basement of their new mansion, warning me that it was the best deal I was going to get before the commercial bank seized my property. She instructed me to sit down, sign the papers quickly, and let the real professionals handle the fallout. I did not sit down immediately. I stood behind the leather chair at the opposite end of the table and looked directly at my son. I looked past the expensive suit and the styled hair, searching for any trace of the boy I had raised. There was nothing left. The empathy, the conscience, the basic human decency had been entirely hollowed out and replaced by raw, unadulterated greed. He was looking at me, but he did not see his father. He only saw a stepping stone, an obstacle he needed to crush to secure his fortune. The two defense lawyers pushed a thick stack of documents across the polished wood, stopping just in front of my chair. They uncapped a heavy silver pen and placed it next to the papers. They were expecting tears. They were expecting a desperate plea for mercy or a dramatic display of fatherly grief. They were entirely unprepared for the absolute freezing silence I brought into the room. I finally pulled out the chair and sat down. Vincent took the seat next to me, placing his worn leather briefcase on the table with a soft thud. I did not look at the bankruptcy papers. I did not touch the silver pen. I placed my calloused hands flat on the cool mahogany surface and took a slow, deep breath, letting the tension in the room build until it was almost suffocating. The smug smile on Matthew's face began to falter slightly under the weight of my stare. He shifted in his chair, glancing quickly at his lawyers. He thought he was the architect of this meeting. He thought he had trapped me in a corner. But as I looked across the table, I felt the familiar cold precision of a master engineer preparing to detonate a controlled demolition. The charges were set. The blast radius was calculated. The silent adjustment was over. It was time for the shockwave. The silence in the conference room stretched heavy and profound. Matthew's initial confidence visibly began to crack. He expected me to immediately reach for the pen. When I did not move, he leaned forward, pushing the thick stack of bankruptcy documents another inch across the mahogany table until they touched the edge of my legal pad. He tapped his index finger against the signature line, a gesture of absolute condescension. He dropped the caring son routine and adopted the sharp, impatient tone of an executive dealing with a slow employee. He told me to stop dragging this out. He said he had a very important closing scheduled for tomorrow morning, an acquisition deal that was going to secure his legacy in the tech industry. He actually had the audacity to mention the sale of the algorithm, completely unaware that he no longer possessed anything to sell. He demanded that I sign the papers immediately so the commercial bank would freeze their collection efforts and stop bothering him. He looked me straight in the eye and said I owed him this final favor because he had suffered enough stress trying to manage the company I had supposedly ruined. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared at the pen resting on the table. The absolute lack of panic in my demeanor deeply unsettled Natalie. She had built her entire life on intimidation and arrogance, and she could not understand why her poison was not working. She leaned across the table, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure malice. She slammed her hand down next to the bankruptcy papers, her expensive rings clicking sharply against the wood. She abandoned all pretense of family loyalty. She told me she was tired of waiting for me to understand my place. She lowered her voice to a dangerous hiss, threatening me directly. She said if I refused to sign the bankruptcy documents right now, she had her own attorneys prepared to file an emergency petition with the state. She threatened to call Adult Protective Services and have me legally declared mentally incompetent. She listed her fabricated evidence with terrifying speed. She claimed she would tell a judge that my recent behavior was erratic, that my grief over my late wife had finally broken my mind, and that I was no longer capable of managing my own financial affairs. She smiled a cold, predatory expression. She explained exactly how the guardianship trap worked. Once the court declared me incompetent, the state would strip away my legal autonomy. They would appoint Matthew as my primary guardian. As my guardian, Matthew would immediately gain absolute control over my house, my military pension, and my bank accounts. He would have the legal authority to sign the bankruptcy papers on my behalf, execute the sale of my property, to cover his debts, and forcefully relocate me to the cheapest state-funded nursing facility he could find. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs, entirely pleased with her own cruelty. She told me I had two choices. I could sign the papers voluntarily and live in their basement, or I could refuse, be declared insane, and die alone in a state facility with absolutely nothing. The two defense attorneys sitting beside them remained silent, their faces completely impassive. They were fully prepared to execute her horrific threat. Matthew watched me closely, waiting for the terror to break my spirit. He expected me to crumble under the sheer weight of their legal extortion. He expected me to realize that I was completely trapped, instead of crying, instead of begging. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked at Natalie, admiring the absolute ruthlessness of her plan. It was a brilliant, vicious strategy. It was exactly the kind of move a predator makes when they believe they have cornered a helpless animal. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic in the room. They thought they were holding a gun to my head. They did not realize I had already emptied the chamber. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen. Matthew let out a soft sigh of relief, leaning back in his chair, believing the battle was finally over. Natalie smirked, reaching for her designer handbag ready to leave. I held the pen for a moment, feeling its weight. Then I set it down gently on the table, completely avoiding the bankruptcy papers. I looked directly at my son. I told him I was not going to sign the documents. I told him I was never going to live in his basement. And I told Natalie she was welcome to call the state authorities, but they were going to be far more interested in her offshore banking records than my mental health. Matthew frowned, leaning forward again, his voice rising in panic. He demanded to know what I was talking about. He told me I had no leverage, no money, and no power to fight them. I turned to Vincent, who was sitting quietly beside me. I gave him a short, decisive nod. Vincent unlatched his leather briefcase. The snap of the metal locks echoed loudly in the tense silence of the conference room. It was the sound of a guillotine finally dropping. The time for silent adjustments was over. It was time for absolute destruction. Vincent the attorney reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single manila folder. He did not open it immediately. He simply placed it on the mahogany table in front of me, resting his hand on top of it. I looked at Matthew, whose confidence had suddenly been entirely shattered by my refusal to capitulate. He was staring at the folder, his mind frantically trying to calculate what leverage I could possibly possess. I told Matthew that he had made a series of massive structural errors when he built his empire. I explained that an engineer never assumes a foundation is secure simply because the building looks impressive from the outside. You have to check the load-bearing pillars. You have to verify the integrity of the materials. And most importantly, you have to ensure that the person holding the blueprints is actually on your side. I told him I had spent the last 48 hours inspecting the foundation of Apex Solutions. I knew exactly how he had secured the $2.5 million commercial loan using my stolen financial history. I knew about the forged signature on the state corporate charter that deliberately listed me as the absolute owner and chief executive officer. And I knew about the massive systematic offshore wire transfers to Natalie's secret trust account designed to drain the company of all operating capital before the impending bankruptcy. Natalie's face completely lost its color. She instinctively gripped the handles of her expensive handbag, her eyes darting nervously toward her two defense attorneys. The lawyers exchanged a sharp, concerned glance. They realized immediately that they had stepped into a room without knowing the full extent of their client's exposure. Matthew tried to interrupt, his voice rising in panic, demanding to know how I had accessed his secure banking records. I ignored him entirely. I opened the manila folder and pulled out the first document. It was the official certified transaction log from the primary commercial bank. I slid it across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of my son. I instructed him to read the final line item. He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly. The document confirmed that the $2.5 million commercial loan, the massive debt he had anchored to my life, was no longer in default. In fact, it was no longer active at all. The document clearly showed that the loan had been paid off in full just 2 hours prior to this meeting. Every single cent of the principal and the accumulated interest had been satisfied. The bank had officially released the impending lien on my residential property and permanently canceled the garnishment order against my military pension. My name and my financial future were completely clear. Matthew stared at the paper, his mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the mathematics. He knew the corporate accounts were completely drained. He knew he had hidden the stolen capital offshore. He looked up at me, his voice barely a whisper, asking how I could possibly have acquired $2.5 million in cash to satisfy the debt. I reached back into the manila folder and pulled out the second document. This was not a banking receipt. This was a thick, multi-page legal contract bearing the official seal of the massive Silicon Valley technology conglomerate. I did not slide this document across the table. I held it up so the harsh morning light caught the heavy ink of the signatures. I told Matthew that I had fully accepted the heavy burden he had placed upon me when he forged the corporate charter. Since he had legally designated me as the sole owner and supreme executive authority of Apex Solutions, I realized I had a profound fiduciary responsibility to maximize the value of the company's assets. I explained that I had discovered the incredible proprietary routing algorithm his team of software engineers had developed. I knew he was planning to finalize the sale tomorrow morning, pocket the $3 million purchase price in Natalie's offshore account, and let the hollowed-out company collapse on top of me. Matthew's eyes went wide with pure terror. He lunged forward, trying to grab the document from my hand, but Vincent quickly intercepted, pushing my son back into his leather chair. The two defense attorneys finally spoke, demanding to see the contract, their voices sharp with professional alarm. I told them they did not need to read it to understand the outcome. I explained that yesterday afternoon, acting entirely within my legal authority as the chief executive officer, I had intercepted the acquisition team at their hotel. I had informed them that Matthew Dalton was nothing more than an external consultant with absolutely zero executive power. I presented the state charter proving my ownership, and they immediately agreed to bypass him. I looked directly into my son's eyes and delivered the final devastating reality. I told him I had executed the sale of the algorithm myself. I had redirected the entire $3 million purchase price into a secure domestic escrow account controlled by Vincent's law firm. That money was entirely untouchable by him or his wife. And it was from that escrow account that I had paid off the commercial loan, clearing my name and saving my home. Matthew sank back into his chair, completely paralyzed. The breath left his lungs in a ragged gasp. He realized that the masterpiece he had spent 3 years building had been completely dismantled in less than 24 hours by the old man he had discarded in the lobby. He had nothing left. The money was gone. The algorithm was gone. The company was completely dead. The silent adjustment was complete, and the impact was absolute. Matthew stared at me across the polished mahogany table, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly without producing a single sound. The reality of the $3 million algorithm sale was simply too massive for his arrogant mind to immediately absorb. He looked frantically at his 2 expensive defense attorneys, silently begging them to find a legal loophole or a procedural error to save him. The lead defense attorney carefully picked up the certified bank receipt and the executed technology acquisition contract. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and read through the heavy ink signatures with intense scrutiny. The grand conference room was completely silent except for the crisp, terrifying rustle of the paper. I watched the attorney's face closely. I saw the exact moment his professional confidence completely collapsed. He realized he was not defending a brilliant corporate founder navigating a complex bankruptcy. He was sitting next to a man who had committed massive federal fraud and who had just legally lost every single penny of his stolen capital. The attorney slowly lowered the documents and looked at Matthew with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound professional alarm. He leaned over and whispered sharply into my son's ear. I could not hear the exact words he used, but I saw the color completely drain from Matthew's face. He finally understood that I was not bluffing. The money was gone. The algorithm was gone. His entire kingdom had been legally sold out from under him by the very man he had tried to destroy. Matthew slammed his fists against the table, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the room. He shouted that I had absolutely no right to steal his life's work. He screamed that he was the visionary, he was the creator, and I was just an ignorant old man who understood absolutely nothing about the modern technological world. He demanded that I pick up the phone and reverse the transaction immediately. I did not raise my voice to match his sudden, violent hysteria. I simply reached back into my leather folder and extracted one final piece of paper. It was printed on heavy, expensive corporate letterhead, bearing the official seal of Apex Solutions. I placed it flat on the table and slid it precisely across the wood until it stopped right in front of his trembling hands. I told him he was absolutely correct about one thing. I was not a software visionary. I was just a structural engineer. But as a master engineer, I knew exactly how to dismantle a highly toxic and corrupted structure to protect the surrounding environment. I instructed him to read the bold text printed at the very top of the page. He looked down, his eyes darting frantically across the black ink. It was an official notice of immediate employment termination. I reminded him that according to the very corporate charter he had forged to protect himself from liability, he was legally classified as an independent external consultant. He was an at-will employee operating entirely under the absolute discretion of the chief executive officer. And as the absolute owner and chief executive officer of Apex Solutions, I was formally firing him for cause. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single syllable echoed clearly in the large room. I defined the exact cause for his termination. I cited the deliberate, malicious forgery of federal financial documents. I cited the unauthorized and highly illegal transfer of millions of dollars in corporate operating capital to a private offshore trust account. I cited the gross negligence that had placed the entire corporate entity in imminent danger of catastrophic financial default. I told him that his lucrative consulting contract was permanently canceled, effective immediately. He was completely stripped of his salary, his bonuses, and any future royalty rights associated with the proprietary routing algorithm. He was legally dead in the water. Matthew stared at the termination notice as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike his face. He shook his head violently, completely, refusing to accept the reality of his total defeat. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his sleek silver corporate mobile phone. He aggressively declared he was going to call the technology conglomerate himself and tell them the sale was entirely fraudulent. He threatened to call the police and report me for corporate theft. Before he could even unlock the digital screen, I stood up from my leather chair. I commanded him to put the device down. I projected my voice using the deep, commanding tone I used to halt heavy machinery on loud construction sites. I told him that the phone he was holding did not belong to him. The luxury laptop sitting inside his leather messenger bag on the floor did not belong to him. Those were corporate assets purchased entirely with company funds, and he was no longer an employee of my company. I demanded that he surrender all corporate property immediately. I demanded the mobile phone, the laptop computer, the digital server access keys, and the physical security badges for the downtown office tower. Matthew clutched the phone tightly to his chest, like a frightened child protecting a stolen toy. He looked at me with genuine burning hatred and flatly refused. He said I would have to pry the devices from his cold, dead hands. That was the precise moment his own legal defense team finally intervened. The lead defense attorney reached out and firmly grabbed Matthew's wrist, physically forcing him to lower the phone to the table. The lawyer did not speak to my son with any of the respect he had shown him 10 minutes earlier. He spoke to him with sharp legal panic. The attorney turned his attention directly to Vincent and asked a single highly specific question. He asked if the escrow account holding the $3 million was fully secured and immune to external access. Vincent nodded his head and confirmed that the funds were entirely locked down by our legal firm and absolutely no money would be dispersed to any offshore accounts or unauthorized vendors. The two defense attorneys immediately began packing their briefcases. They shoved their legal pads, their expensive pens, and their printed files into their bags with frantic speed. Matthew looked at them in complete shock. He reached out and grabbed his lawyer's sleeve, begging them to do something, demanding they file an emergency injunction to stop me. The lead attorney roughly pulled his arm away and snapped the brass locks of his briefcase shut. He looked down at his former client with absolute disdain. He stated very clearly that their massive legal retainer was supposed to be paid by the corporate operating account the following morning. Since the corporate accounts were completely frozen by the chief executive officer and the company no longer possessed any assets to liquidate, Matthew had absolutely zero funds to pay for their legal services. Furthermore, the attorney bluntly stated that his firm absolutely refused to represent a client who had actively concealed massive federal fraud and offshore embezzlement during their initial confidential consultations. He told Matthew he was completely on his own and advised him to remain entirely silent. The two lawyers turned their backs on my son and walked rapidly out of the conference room, the heavy mahogany doors shutting firmly behind them. They abandoned him on the spot. Matthew was entirely alone. Natalie was still sitting next to him, but she had physically pulled her chair away, creating a highly visible distance between them as she realized the horrifying extent of their ruin. I looked down at the boy I had raised. For 3 years, he had lived a life of ultimate luxury, funded entirely by my stolen identity. He had driven expensive cars, eaten at the finest restaurants, and presented himself to the world as a genius of the modern tech industry. Now he was sitting in a rented conference room, stripped of his grand title, stripped of his stolen assets, and abandoned by the people he paid to protect him. But I was not finished. I told him the termination notice was not just a piece of paper meant for the internal company filing cabinets. I explained that as the legally recognized chief executive officer, I was strictly required by law to report the exact reasons for his termination to the State Labor Board and the Federal Financial Regulatory Commissions. I told him the official public record would clearly state he was fired for massive corporate embezzlement, document forgery, and identity fraud. I promised him that within 24 hours, every single venture capital firm, every angel investor, and every technology board of directors in the entire country would have immediate access to that public filing. I told him I was going to systematically and permanently destroy his professional reputation. No legitimate company would ever hire him to manage their projects. No commercial bank would ever approve him for a business loan. His entire career in the technology sector was completely eradicated in a single stroke. He had tried to bury me under a mountain of debt to build his glorious legacy, so I had simply taken control of the demolition charges and completely leveled his future. I pointed to the items on the table. I told him to leave the laptop, leave the phone, and walk out of the room. I told him he had absolutely nothing left in my world. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving a suffocating silence in the wake of the departing lawyers. Matthew remained frozen in his leather chair, completely paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his entire career. But Natalie possessed a different kind of survival instinct. She had always been the true architect of the financial extraction. She stood up from her chair and aggressively smoothed the wrinkles from her designer dress. She was desperately trying to project strength and regain control of a room that had just collapsed around her. She looked at her husband with absolute disgust for his weakness. Then she turned her sharp gaze directly toward me. She tilted her head and offered a cold, trembling smile. She told me I could keep the $3 million from the software sale. She claimed that she and Matthew did not even need the company anymore. She bragged that they had already secured their future over the past 2 years. She proudly reminded me of the luxury estate they had recently purchased in cash. She told me I could play the role of the chief executive officer in an empty building, but they were going to walk away incredibly rich. She picked up her expensive leather handbag and told Matthew to get up so they could leave. I did not move from my seat. I looked at the absolute delusion radiating from her face. I told her she was fundamentally misunderstanding the structural reality of her situation. I explained that a fortress built entirely on stolen money is not a sanctuary. It is simply a federal prison waiting for the doors to be locked. I asked her if she truly believed I would trace the stolen operating capital to her offshore trust and then simply allow her to enjoy the sunshine. Natalie let out a sharp, nervous laugh. She crossed her arms and boldly stated that her offshore trust was completely bulletproof. She claimed that domestic civil courts had absolutely no legal jurisdiction over her private international accounts. She was completely confident that the money was untouchable. I nodded my head slowly. I told her that a standard civil judge would indeed struggle to penetrate a tropical tax haven. But I informed her that I had not wasted my time filing a civil lawsuit. I told Natalie that as the legally recognized chief executive officer of Apex Solutions, I carried a strict fiduciary duty to report any suspected corporate embezzlement. I revealed that at 8 o'clock yesterday morning, Vincent had submitted the complete unredacted wire transfer logs directly to the federal tax investigators. The arrogant smile vanished from Natalie's face in a fraction of a second. Her skin turned a sickly pale shade of white. I continued speaking with absolute mechanical precision. I told her we had handed the federal agents the exact international routing numbers, the specific dates of the transfers, and the primary beneficiary documents bearing her name. I explained the brutal mechanics of federal asset forfeiture. I told her that because the money used to purchase her new luxury estate was directly tied to domestic corporate fraud and illegal wire tampering. The house was now legally classified as a toxic asset. I promised her that the federal government was not going to file a polite civil summons. They were going to unilaterally freeze the offshore trust by the end of the business day. They were going to march up the driveway of her beautiful new estate and place a federal seizure notice directly on the front gates. I looked her directly in the eyes and delivered the final blow. I told her she was not going to live in a mansion. She was going to face multiple federal indictments for international wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. The composed, arrogant woman completely shattered. Natalie let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She dropped her designer handbag, sending her items scattering across the floor. She lunged toward Matthew, grabbing his tailored suit, shaking him violently. She demanded that he fix the situation, screaming that she was not going to a federal prison for his mistakes. Matthew simply stared at the wall, completely empty. Natalie realized her entire reality had been eradicated. She collapsed onto her knees on the thick hotel carpet, sobbing uncontrollably. She begged me to call the investigators and tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I looked down at her and stated quietly that gravity cannot be reversed. The demolition was proceeding exactly as planned. The full, horrifying weight of the federal tax investigation finally crashed down on my son. Matthew watched his wife sobbing on the floor, surrounded by the scattered contents of her designer handbag. He looked at the heavy mahogany doors where his expensive lawyers had just abandoned him. He was completely trapped in a nightmare of his own, making a nightmare he had designed specifically for me. The arrogant executive persona completely dissolved. The bespoke suit suddenly looked entirely out of place on a man who was rapidly losing his mind. Matthew slowly stood up from his leather chair. His legs trembled so violently he could barely hold his own weight. He took 2 steps toward me and then completely collapsed. My son, the man who had ordered security to throw me out of his building, the man who had offered me a concrete floor in his basement, dropped to his hands and knees on the thick hotel carpet. He crawled toward my chair. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the fabric of my denim work jacket. He did not call me by my first name. He called me Dad. He used the exact same desperate, pleading tone he had used when he was a little boy, asking me to fix a broken toy. He begged me to stop the demolition. He pleaded with me to call Vincent and reverse the email to the federal investigators. He swore he would divorce Natalie. He promised he would sign the house over to me. He begged for another chance, crying that he did not want to spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary. He gripped my jacket so tightly, his knuckles turned white, burying his face into my knees, sobbing uncontrollably. He was begging his father to save him from the absolute ruin he had built. I did not reach down and stroke his hair. I did not offer him a comforting embrace. I looked down at the top of his head, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers off my jacket. I pushed him back, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. I told him he was fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of a structural collapse. Once the load-bearing pillars are removed, no one can stop the building from falling. I told him I could not save him even if I wanted to. I explained the mathematics of the situation. I reminded him that the proprietary algorithm had sold for exactly $3 million. I had used $2.5 million to pay off the fraudulent commercial loan, completely clearing my name and securing my property. That left exactly $500,000 in the legal escrow account controlled by Vincent. Matthew's eyes suddenly lit up with a desperate, frantic hope. He begged me for the remaining $500,000. He pleaded that it was enough money for him to hire a new criminal defense team and flee the country before the federal indictments were unsealed. He begged me to give him the money as a final act of fatherly love. I shook my head slowly, extinguishing that final desperate spark of hope. I told him he was never going to touch a single penny of that money. I explained that the $500,000 was not profit. It was blood money generated by a company built entirely on elder abuse and identity theft. I told him I refused to keep it, and I absolutely refused to give it to a criminal. I looked at him and delivered the absolute final consequence. I informed him that exactly 1 hour ago, acting as the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Solutions, I had legally and irrevocably donated the entire remaining balance of $500,000. I told him the funds had already been wired directly to a national nonprofit organization dedicated exclusively to providing emergency legal aid and housing for elderly victims of financial fraud. Matthew stared at me, his mouth open, absolutely unable to comprehend the finality of the action. The money was permanently gone, safely secured in the hands of a charity designed to fight monsters exactly like him. He had absolutely zero resources left. He had no company, no algorithm, no offshore trust, no lawyers, and no escape fund. I had taken every single piece of his stolen empire and used it to fortify the very walls he had tried to tear down. I told him the silent adjustment was permanently closed. There was nothing left to discuss. I did not wait for my son to stop crying on the hotel floor. I turned my back on the absolute ruin he had created for himself and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. Vincent walked quietly beside me. We stepped out of the conference room and did not look back. We rode the elevator down to the ground floor in a comfortable and profound silence. When we reached the marble lobby, Vincent stopped and extended his hand. I shook it firmly, thanking him for his brilliant legal mind and his unwavering loyalty. He told me it was an absolute honor to watch a master engineer properly dismantle a corrupted structure. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the bustling city street. The morning air was crisp and clear. The suffocating weight that had rested on my chest for the past several days was completely gone. I was entirely free. I climbed into the cabin of my old pickup truck and started the engine. As I drove away from the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district, I felt a profound sense of peace settle deeply into my bones. The massive $2.5 million anchor had been permanently cut from my neck. My name was completely clear. My military pension was safe. More importantly, the toxic tumor that had been quietly draining my life for decades was finally eradicated. It is a terrible and unnatural thing for a father to realize he must entirely sever his only child from his life. But true survival often requires ruthless surgery. I had spent my entire life trying to support a human structure that was fundamentally rotten. I had finally stopped trying to save him, and in doing so, I had completely saved myself. I pulled into my driveway and parked my truck under the shade of the old oak tree. I walked up the front steps of the house I had built with Barbara. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped inside. The house was incredibly quiet, but it was no longer the heavy and lonely silence of a grieving widower. It was the warm and secure silence of a fortress that had successfully withstood a massive siege. I walked into the kitchen and filled the glass carafe with fresh water. I measured out the dark roasted coffee grounds and turned on the brewing machine. The rich and familiar aroma quickly filled the room completely, replacing the sterile and metallic smell of the bank vaults and the hotel conference rooms. I poured the hot coffee into my favorite ceramic mug. I took a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread pleasantly through my chest. I walked out the back door and stepped onto the wooden patio. The morning sun was shining brightly over the green lawn. I walked over to the southern brick wall, where my climbing roses grew wild and vibrant. I bent down and picked up the metal pruning shears I had dropped in the dirt when the commercial bank first called me just a few days ago. I brushed the dark soil off the handles. I took another sip of my coffee, set the mug on the brick wall, and looked closely at the thorny branches. You cannot force a dying and infected branch to produce beautiful flowers. You must locate the rot, take your sharpest blades, and cut it away completely without a single ounce of hesitation. Only then can the rest of the plant truly thrive and survive the coming winter. I positioned the metal shears around a dead branch and squeezed the handles together. The cut was clean. The silent adjustment was absolutely perfect. The most difficult lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that unconditional sacrifice can easily become the soil where absolute entitlement grows. For decades, I believed that shielding my son from the consequences of his actions was the ultimate expression of fatherly love. I was completely wrong. By constantly acting as his financial safety net, I taught him that my dignity and security were entirely disposable resources. Real love sometimes requires the immense strength to let a corrupted structure collapse. We must never allow the bonds of blood to become the chains of our own destruction. True family is built on mutual respect rather than parasitic extraction. If you have ever found the strength to walk away from a toxic family member to protect your own peace, please share your experience in the comments below. and subscribe for more stories of survival.